Safety Office Hours. I'm your moderator, Sam Alkin, Associate Professor here in the Department of Food Science. I just came back from Portland, Maine, at a wonderful meeting of the Northeast Center for the Advancement of Food Safety, which brings together food safety experts in academia, regulatory agencies, and industry to kind of talk about the needs of produce growers and food processors in relation to food safety. And one of the perennial challenges is how do we connect farms and businesses with vetted resources that can help them develop, review, and implement their food safety programs. Consultants are a key resource to many on the food safety journey, but they're a very significant investment. So how do you evaluate whether a food safety consultant has the expertise to help you develop an effective food safety program? Well, we talk to some other experts, and that's why we've got this great panel today to kind of help us talk through, how do we certify food safety consultants? What are things that we should be thinking about? And on our panel today, if we go to the next slide, we will have Dr. Elizabeth Bihn, who is the director of the Produce Safety Alliance, giving us a talk on how we think through that process. And then we'll have Dr. Martin Wiedemann, the Gellert Family Professor in Food Safety and the co-director of the New York State Integrated Food Safety Center of Excellence, joining us, as well as Kelly Coughlin, who is the co-founder of Stony Brook Wholehearted Foods, a manufacturer of culinary oils and seed snacks in Geneva, New York, that features local farm-sourced ingredients. She received her BA from Cornell University with a double major in bio and English. Great to see Big Red. And then a master's in public health from Harvard University. And she has been through this food safety journey quite a bit. We were going to have Dr. Jennifer McIntyre join us, but unfortunately, she had
I'm here, Sam.
Here, Sam. Oh, there you are. I wasn't sure if you're going to. So thank you, Dr. McIntyre. She recently rejoined the world of food safety consulting after serving as the Chief Food Safety and Regulatory Officer for the International Fresh Produce Association for 7 years, and she has over 20 years of experience in the space. So thank you for joining us too, Jennifer. And so with that, I'm going to hand over the reins to Betsy to kind of help us think through how do we pick a food safety consultant. Take it away.
Thanks a bunch, Sam. So what I plan to do is run through just a discussion about how do you select a consultant. I want to share a little bit about a program we're developing as an educational route to help consultants learn about produce safety. And then I'll hand it back to the panel, and we'll hopefully get you out of here within the hour. So I do want to preface this by saying a lot of this presentation is drawn from a fact sheet that Kelly Coughlin, who's on the call today, and Beth Demings and I developed about selecting a sanitary design consultant. And the idea we thought here was just to summarize some of the key pieces that go in to selecting a consultant. And I'm going to go through each of these with a slide just to talk through it. First of all, should you hire a consultant? Do you really need one? What's the role once you decide to hire one? How do you find a qualified consultant? What kind of expertise are you looking for? And how do you check their references? How do you know that they've done good work in the past? Preparing an agreement. What's that relationship with the consultant going to look like in the short term and in the long term? And then some final considerations, and then I'll move to the discussion about the program we have. So when discussing about whether or not you should hire a consultant, usually it's because your project, whatever you're working on or whatever your concern is, requires expertise you don't have, or maybe you're looking for an external opinion, right? So maybe you have some background in this, but you're just looking for another expert opinion. And once you bring that in, you can help to refine your food safety program. It's important to know, especially for all the operations that are on the phone, you don't just hire a consultant for food safety, but this part is kind of driven towards that idea of what consultants can do for you in food safety. First, make sure you have the time to commit to the effort to choose a consultant wisely and to spend time with the consultant, because it really does require that interaction. The benefit of receiving good guidance can really be significant for what you're trying to do. But a poorly selected consultant, and one that you don't interact with, could inversely have a very big negative impact and be a costly burden on your operation. So this is where we get to the idea of prioritizing communication. Thorough and effective communication ensures that you're going to get relevant and accurate information, that you're going to be able to review that information and make changes to your operation that can get you where you want to go. So a consultant really supplements your knowledge, provides that expert opinion, and should be able to give you ideas and perspectives of where you want to go. But ultimately, you have to look at that information and decide what you are going to do. Are the recommendations going to help you get where you want to go? And do you have the ability to implement those recommendations? One of the things that's important is to have somebody in your operation that is dedicated to this interaction with the consultant. It's for two reasons. One, you assure that the consultant knows who to be talking to and who the person is going to be relaying and making those decisions. And two, it gives you that that person who understands the goals and where you're headed. So again, getting back to making sure you have the time and the people to get the most use out of your consultant. How do you find a qualified consultant? And this one has come up in the questions that were submitted to us today. So I think this is a problem. A consultant could be an individual, a partnership, a corporation that has the education certifications or experience. We see some young graduates going into consulting firms. They don't have a lot of experience, but they're joining people who have a lot of experience, right? So sometimes it's a group of people, sometimes it's an independent person. How do you find the consultants? Industry colleagues, right? We all know certain groups of commodity groups. They talk to each other. They may have used someone that they had a really good experience with. You could ask that way. Using your trade organizations. I'm hoping Jennifer will talk about that with her experience with IFPA and the other groups she's been associated with. How does that work? Ask previous consultants you've used. One of the things we noticed is that consultants will have areas of expertise, and good consultants will know when they've reached the boundary of their area of expertise and will recommend somebody else to you that they've worked with, right? So they have those contacts. You can also review websites and professional listings to find people. When you're looking for expertise, the important thing is to make sure you discuss your needs and goals and evaluate their technical qualifications. If you have a good consultant, they will know if what you need is within the bounds of their expertise. And again, if it's not, they can perhaps recommend somebody or say, I'm not the person who can help you. It's important to consider their education and technical training, the years of experience in the field, their knowledge of your industry. This is one of the things we ran into with produce safety, because produce safety is relatively new. And so sometimes consultants think they can move from one area to another. Sometimes they can, but sometimes it's outside of their range of expertise. Knowledge of relevant regulations. Anybody working in the produce world knows that those regulations keep changing and parts of them keep changing. So if you're not up on that, sometimes that can be very difficult. What are they doing for continuing education to ensure they stay up to date? And what are your operational needs and goals from them? Again, getting back to what is it that you need for your operation? That's of primary importance. So looking at other things that we want to think about is, how do consultants, when you're talking to a consultant, how do they stay up to date with the changes in the industry? Look at the different practices, look at the different equipment. Certainly in outbreaks, we have seen problems with consultants that aren't keeping up with changes in equipment, changes in sanitary design or expectations for sanitation. Scientific research, this is changing all the time, and food safety requirements, both regulatory food safety requirements and buyer requirements, right? What does the industry expect from you? Do they have the willingness to work on site to identify the needs of your facility? We know a lot of things are happening remotely over Zoom, right? That's the new happy place. But you got to have people on the ground who understand what your operation looks like, what your practices are, what is your equipment, how does your employee training fit into this? And are they willing to provide follow-up support? Maybe they have an interest in providing consulting for this particular topic, but they don't have the time or the interest in following up with you to make sure some of the recommendations get implemented. Maybe you don't have that interest either, but these are things you should ask right up front so you know what that relationship needs to be. When we talk about checking references, you want to make sure you're getting the consultant that is going to work for you. So ask for those references where they've done work with similar companies doing similar things, right? Have they had experience? What's their track record? What was the degree of satisfaction or the quality of work? Was the pricing, the time frame, did that work for the people they worked with previously? Would that group hire the consultant again? Were there any concerns? These are all just basic questions. They don't have to be accusatory. It's really just a fact-finding mission, right? Did this work? What was the time frame? You know, were you happy with what you got? The other thing is, I've never seen anybody put a reference down that was somebody they didn't get along with, right? So people pick references for projects that went really well. If you know somebody who used the consultant that isn't on their reference list, it's okay to ask how that went. Again, it's not an accusatory thing. Sometimes people aren't going to list all of their references, right? You're not going to list every company you've ever worked with. So if you know somebody who's worked with them, have that conversation. Same thing. How did it go? Were you happy with the results? Did you implement practices that they recommended? These are all things you can ask of those references. When you have an agreement with a consultant, you should actually have a formal agreement so everybody knows what to expect. I find that the one thing that happens is people do not communicate their expectations very well. And I think a contract allows you to communicate those expectations. Again, going through a detailed description of your services, what those expectation is, who is the person going to communicate with? I mentioned this earlier. Who's the conduit? Who's going to be the person from your operation so that the consultant isn't saying, well, I told this person and I told this person, but it didn't get to the right person, right? So it's just ease of communication, most effective use of your time. And time is a really valuable commodity, probably the most valuable commodity. So that's important. What are your project milestones and your timeline? And communicate those things. Certainly in produce, when you're growing a commodity that you're dealing with weather changes and you're dealing with that, timeframes might have to change, but you need to communicate those things and you need to have an agreed timeline. The cost of the project, what are the payment options, confidentiality and non-disclosure agreements. Are they working on something that you developed that you don't want them telling other people about? Again, you got to communicate that. A provision for liability and a proper relationship and plans for terminating the services, right? All of those are very important things. And I think certainly our panel will be able to talk about these if you have additional questions. These final considerations, plan ahead. It's going to take time to find a consultant that meets your needs. All the stuff we talked about, you got to find them, you got to check their references, you got to set up the agreement. All of that takes time. We're talking about months, not weeks, not days. You got to know, you got to plan into their schedule as well. Mostly consultants are making money when they're working. So consultants aren't usually just sitting by the phone with nothing to do. I don't think these days, I don't think anybody's sitting by the phone with nothing to do, but you have to make sure you plan ahead. Do the work again to hire a consultant that you trust and that meets the needs of your project. Understand and evaluate what they recommend. Again, you are the final decision maker. That consultant is recommending what you should do. You need to know where that recommendation comes from. Is it feasible for your operation? Will it be effective for the problem or the issue you have? All very important. Are there regulatory requirements that are in here? And I know I've mentioned like produce and the produce safety rule, but sometimes there's other regulations that apply, right? There's regulations on pesticides, and we've got a new one on traceability. All of these things need to be considered. How do you transfer that knowledge to you and your staff? What's the plan for getting that implemented in your operation? And mechanisms in place to validate the recommendation and assess the project results. This is one that I think we don't always think about long-term. I think it's most valuable to think about it right at the beginning. What do you hope to get out of this? And then evaluate that at the end. So that's really a thought up front, not a thought at the end. All right. So that gets me over the discussions about how to find a consultant. I don't know if there's any questions. I'm going to pause here. If there are any questions about that section, you can put them in the chat box and perhaps our colleagues can answer them. I'm going to quickly move on because I want to make sure I leave time for the panel to talking about a produce safety consultant training and certificate program that we're working on as part of a project right now. And I'll give you some ideas. In fact, one of the questions that was submitted asked, why are you even working on something like this? So I'm hopefully going to answer that question as we go, but if not, you can ask for more details. So one of the things I wanted to share is talking about the evolution of produce safety. And I think this is important because produce safety is relatively new when you look at the broader perspective of food safety over time for different industries and different commodities, dairy, processing, right? Produce safety for fresh fruits and vegetables is a little different and a little newer, I'm going to argue. So we look at in 1998, which was not that long ago, the FDA Guide to Minimize Microbial Food Safety Hazards in Fresh Fruits and Vegetables was put out because they were seeing that fresh produce was being linked to outbreaks, right? People were getting sick, people were dying, there was a problem. But these recommendations were voluntary compliance. So this was not a regulation, right? This was voluntary compliance, letting the industry know we're having trouble. Here at Cornell University in 1999, we started the National Good Agricultural Practices Program. Eventually that grew to include 25 land-grant universities because we recognized the industry was going to need help implementing practices and understanding risks. In the winter of 99 and 2000, we started to see growers get letters from buyers asking about their food safety practices. This is where I really feel like it became industry driven, right? You had buyers really driving the idea of practice implementation, not regulation, because again, that was voluntary compliance. The issue we saw though was inconsistent requests. There was no premium prices for practices, and a lot of growers that I talked to at the time, and at this time I was doing a lot of trade shows, were like, well, if none of my competition is doing food safety, I don't have to do food safety, because they saw it as money out the door that they weren't getting money back in the door for. And I'm sure Jennifer can talk to her experiences about this because I know you were around then too. The spinach outbreak, in my opinion, having worked with farmers, was really an eye-opener to the industry, right? The commodity specific gaps started showing up, certainly with leafy greens and other commodities. Growers started realizing when it made the front page, okay, this is really a problem. Buyers started upping the requirements for audits and all of that stuff. So to me, that was really a game changer of sorts. We also saw at a similar time those multiple salmonella outbreaks in tomatoes. We saw Florida come up with T-gaps, right? So you saw a state program that was commodity specific. FDA announced in a docket in December of 2009 that they were going to look at a regulation. They were going to start pushing towards a regulation. In 2010, the Produce Safety Alliance was established again at Cornell University, and this was focused on small farms and regulatory personnel, making sure they were prepared because they knew the Food Safety Modernization Act was coming. That was signed into law January 4th of 2011. We did not see the final produce safety rule until November 27th of 2015. And again, that was the first ever regulation governing fruit and vegetable production. I walk you through this just so you can see how quickly it went from voluntary guidance to a regulation and that the industry has had to move along. I will say when we talk to growers, there are still growers that do not know there is a regulation out there. If somebody wants to disagree with me on that, we can, but we still see growers that are like, regulation, what? And so the industry is really still adjusting to it. So the project objectives for this were develop a produce safety consulting certificate program. And what we wanted to do there was, sorry, I skipped a thing here. The origin was industry members came to us because they were having trouble finding consultants, that could help them assess risks and implement practices to reduce microbial risk to both meet buyer demand and regulatory requirements. There are food safety consultants. There are many good food safety consultants out there, but the PSR, produce safety rule requirements, are different than other FSMA rules. So if somebody's moving from processing, dealing with the human foods rule into the produce safety rule, it's different. And we were seeing consultants that weren't making that transition very well. It's really important to have qualified consultants in these areas because in the worst case, the bad advice doesn't actually help you reduce the risk you're trying to reduce. And that could result in contamination and illnesses. Less dangerous, but very impactful to the economy of these businesses is you're wasting time and money. And those are two things nobody has enough of. So that's the importance of a qualified consultant. So what were the objectives? Sorry, I said this already. Develop a produce safety consultant certification program. What were we going to do? We were going to identify courses that would provide necessary microbial produce safety knowledge to build content competence. That's the important part in these individuals that work with the produce industry that are focused on reducing microbial risks. Are there other hazards? Of course, there's physical and there's chemical, and those play into it. But the vast majority of the things we're worried about are microbial risks. It would outline the certificate program, including the requirements. How do we progress people through it to make sure they get a certificate, and then we can share that information with the industry, and of course to pilot the produce program. And there's coming up an email where you can email if you're interested in participating, because we are looking for people for that pilot program. So who are our target audiences? This has been really interesting, and Kelly can comment on this later if she wants, but talking about, okay, the consultants are obviously a target audience, but what we likely think is going to happen is you're going to have farm and packing house owners. In some cases, these are going to be your small and medium-sized owners, not necessarily the enormous farm owners, right? Because those are their farm and packing house food safety managers that are going to be a target audience. But the growers and the people that need the information, maybe they're building a new packing house, maybe they're doing other things, where understanding a broader scope of food safety information is more important than just having PSR information, right? So this is a little bit broader to talk about risks beyond just what we see in the PSR. Extension educators are offering a lot of technical assistance to growers. When we do focus groups with growers, this always comes out. Who are you getting your technical assistance from? Smaller, medium-sized growers are using those extension educators quite a bit. And of course, regulatory personnel. I do a lot of training with regulatory personnel, and the turnover in the regulatory personnel is real. We are getting a lot of turnover in those hirings, so a way to keep an educational program available to them that's available on demand. So what's our progress to date? We've established these learning objectives, which is really important. I'm happy to be working with George and Kelly and Toria. George certainly has an education degree, so that's been really helpful with us driving those learning objectives forward. Identify relevant courses, developing needed courses. So not everything is available right now, right? We have courses that are in development that we want to use. That's what we're doing. We have a pre and post test to ensure our course effectiveness, looking at those learning objectives. How do we know if we've been effective with putting people through this program? And then, of course, recruiting participants to pilot the Produce Safety Consultant Certificate Program. Very important to pilot it, to test it, to evaluate it, and make sure it's effective. So what are some of the courses we're looking at? The Produce Safety Alliance Grower Training course, for sure. That's the basis of a lot of what growers are experiencing. I think it's really important for consultants to know what those growers are going through, to experience that. An Intro to Microclass, this is being developed with the Institute for Food Safety at Cornell University. Turns out a lot of people working in fresh produce have had a lot of education on how to grow fresh fruits and vegetables, but not a lot of education on microbiology or food safety. It's one of the things we are constantly working with our colleagues in horticulture. How do we get those food safety classes into production classes? GMPs, 117. So looking at what are good manufacturing practices when you start to move into environments like packing houses, where you have more control than you do in the field. We have a sanitation workshop that we've offered a few times, so that'll be part of it. We're going to offer that in person. We're also developing short courses, and let me just say, this list keeps getting a little bit longer, and there was a question that came in about audits and inspections, right? This is a question we get all the time, understanding the difference between what is a buyer audit versus what is a regulatory inspection. And the FSMA overview. Are there other rules that are impacting the produce world, right? Produce safety rule for sure, but how does human foods play into that? Are you donating or selling your culls to the animal foods rule? What about traceability? All of those things play into it. We intend to have an annual update to maintain the certificate because, as I said, in the produce safety world, that regulation keeps changing, and we expect it to keep changing for a while until those sections are all done. And then looking at other things like traceability or the Food Safety Modernization Act's rule on traceability and how to incorporate those kind of additional things. So this is where we'd like you to, if you're interested in this experience, all enrollment costs are going to be waived for the piloting program. So really it's to test the program. If you know, like, this sounds great, I want to be involved, then I recommend you email Toria. There's her email up there. If you're like, still don't get what you're talking about, Bets, go ahead and email me. We can set up a time to talk and I can walk you through the details of what we're trying to do. So with that, I want to acknowledge Kelly, George, and Toria, who have been working on this with me, as well as the PSA team, who has been doing a lot of backfill on what are the objectives, what are problems we're seeing in the industry when we're working with growers, and certainly the funding that comes from the New York State Department of Ag and Markets through the Specialty Crop Block Grant Program. And with that, I will take any questions about that or anything I've said. But I also want to go ahead and hand it back to Sam so that he can facilitate and moderate the discussion with our panel. Thank you.